Welcome to In Conversation with David Frum. I'm your host, Sean Spear, editor-at-large at The Hub. I'm glad to be back in conversation with David for another installment of our bi-weekly video and podcast series on the key issues concerning Canadian policy in politics. In today's episode, we have a lot to discuss. We're speaking the morning of the imposition of Donald Trump's tariffs on Canada. Of course, last week we had the episode in the Oval Office between President Trump and Vice President Vance and Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, and a whole host of other issues for which I'm keen to get David's insights and analysis. David, thanks as always for joining me.
Thank you. As I think about the events of recent days, I remember back in the 80s going to a film, it had been much praised, called The Decline of the American Empire.
Okay.
And I expected a profound meditation on national greatness and its causes of ruin. It turned out to be just a dumb sex comedy about middle-aged French Canadians. And I was very disappointed as I came out of the movie. But now I think I wish The Decline of the American Empire were just a dumb sex comedy about French Canadians instead of being the literal thing that we are watching unfold in front of us.
Yeah, we'll get into some of those big macro conditions behind a lot of what we've seen over the past week or so. But for our Canadian audience, I have to start with tariffs. We've been anticipating these tariffs for some time. They're finally here. What's your immediate reaction to what's played out in the past 24 hours or so?
I think a lot of intellectual energy has been spent by what I call soft Trumpers, trying to explain maybe it's not as bad. Maybe it won't really happen. Maybe it's in service of some larger goal.
Yes.
And we have talked about this a lot. You just have to. Donald Trump thinks like a primitive tribesman. That his idea of how you get rich is you go to the next village, you burn down all the huts, and you take their stuff.
Yes.
And that's why he's done these tariffs. He thinks countries get rich by taking things from others, by not trading. And he's engaged in this predatory action. He doesn't have a strategic plan. The tariffs are an end in themselves. And they're going to start a cycle of retaliation from which it will be quite difficult for cooler heads to escape.
Well, in that vein, what is the reaction more broadly in Washington and elsewhere in the United States, David? How are business leaders, policymakers, and others responding not just to the immediacy of these tariffs, but as you say, the fallout that's likely to come?
Well, let me tell you about one Republican senator. Joni Ernst is a senator from Iowa.
Yes.
She's been an outspoken advocate on defense and veterans issues. She's a very capable person, and a more or less normal Republican with more or less normal views on trade and national security. The Trump people are preparing to mount a primary campaign against her.
Wow.
And funded by Elon Musk. And today, they just dropped a lot of embarrassing information about her post-divorce personal life to shame her out of the race. So, look, I think privately, many of the leading figures in the Republican Party are horrified. But publicly, they say nothing. And the Democrats are paralyzed in this way. Look, Trump doesn't have a functional majority in the House of Representatives.
Yes.
The Republicans have, depending on how many absences there are that day, somewhere between 1, 2, 3 seat majority in the House. But half a dozen of their members are open lunatics, and so they don't have a functioning majority. So we're heading toward a government shutdown, even as Donald Trump, in which the Republicans are begging for Democratic votes to save them from their own caucus. Even as Republicans are making no concessions on any issues, even such basic things as please don't violate the Constitution by impounding funds illegally that Congress has authorized to spend. Please don't betray Ukraine. Please don't blow up the World Trade System. And the Trump attitude has been, we are driving this car straight at the wall, and we want your credit card to pay for the gasoline that allows us to do it. And Democrats are seriously debating whether to do that or not. So it's a system in which a lot of the restraints that you would expect are not present, are not operating. They may operate later, but how long can Ukraine resist? And how rapidly does the trade dispute turn into a global depression?
Yeah, it's not reassuring for our Canadian listeners and viewers, David. One thing I know that's on top of their minds, it's something we've talked about a bit in the past, is the perception that we are being disproportionately targeted, that Trump, of course, has talked about tariffs in the past. In fact, we ourselves have discussed the extent to which this is one of the few issues where he's been consistent. But what are we to understand about the disproportionate 25% targets on Canada's economy, while most of the rest of the world remains, at least for now, free from the imposition of tariffs?
Well, there are big tariffs on Mexico, and there are big tariffs, of course, on China. I think you should see this as simply Trump reneging on his signature on the Canada-U.S.-Mexico agreement of his first term. He criticized NAFTA. He didn't believe in continental free trade. He was persuaded by the first-term people to renegotiate parts of NAFTA to make it somewhat more protectionist against China and other third countries. And he hailed that as a great achievement, but he clearly regrets it. And Canada is being targeted because the relationship is unusually intimate. And if your goal is to sever the United States from trade connections with other countries, Canada's not in the Trumpian collection of offenses, it's not the worst offender, but this is the most dramatic way of saying that the United States is going to be an economic island. It's going to buy and sell by itself. One of the things that Trump said just on Monday was he issued one of his Truth Social posts about how Americans are going to have to get ready to stop exporting so much food because he does understand that one of the things that is happening here is the collapse of American agricultural exports. In his first term, he wrecked U.S. soybean exports. The United States had been the world's largest soybean exporter. Now that title belongs to Brazil, mostly because Trump pushed China to reorient its soybean purchases from the United States to Brazil. Other exported goods are now about to take the hit too.
David, I want to ask you about Canada's response. As you know, I spend part of my time in the United States and part in Canada, and I've just been struck by the rawness within the Canadian population, both to the threat and now imposition of tariffs, but also the broader provocations about Canadian independence. It's, in my mind, created a set of political conditions here which tend in the direction towards a maximalist response. Today, for instance, Ontario Premier Doug Ford is threatening to turn off electricity exports to various U.S. states. How should Canadian policymakers be thinking about what's happening and the best way for Canada to protect itself in the short term, but also to minimize the harm to our economy over the medium and long term?
Look, I understand why there's such outrage in Canada. Other trade disputes with the United States, and there are many, have some kind of predicate. So the long-running softwood lumber dispute, what that's ultimately about is in the United States, forests tend to be privately owned, and in Canada, forests are mostly publicly owned. And the Canadian forests are much larger, they're more scientifically managed, and therefore the lumber is sold at a lower price than from the American forests, even though the environmental conditions in Canada are often less benign. And so the Americans say, that looks like to us like a subsidy. You're using public money to keep your forest costs down, and Canadians say, no, it's not. But everyone understands what this fight is about, and the American position, even if Canadians reject it, is not completely made up, fanciful, demented.
Yes.
And there are other disputes too that if healthcare is the largest cost an automaker pays, and in Canada healthcare costs are absorbed by the government, is that a subsidy to Canadian auto factories at the expense of American auto factories? Again, there's a predicate.
Yes.
In this case, there's no predicate. It's just Trump is doing this as a pure act of whim and will.
Yes.
And joining it, not to any rational set of economic concerns, but to an outspoken attack on Canadian sovereignty. What my goal here, actually, is to force you to surrender your national existence. That's my goal. I'm not trying to make you charge a higher stumpage fee per log, like some rational predecessor. I'm not trying to get some offset for the value of the government picking up the healthcare costs. I want you to die, Mr. Bond. So Canadians understandably resent that.
Yes.
And they feel betrayed because this relationship has been so positive, so benign for so long. It's out of the blue. It's like watching, it's like watching some crazy person on the street walking around slapping old ladies. And why doesn't somebody stop them?
Let me ask you point blank, David, if you were advising Canadian policymakers, would you recommend retaliating with our own tariffs, or do you think that does more harm than good?
I would be for the maximalist response for this reason. The only way we get out of this, like the problem is Trump is surrounded by a structure of enablement, and the key ingredient of the enablement is the rationalization. He's got something in mind. This won't be so expensive. It won't be so bad. He's not actually going to do the whole thing. That there needs to be a rapid shock. If the stock market had gone down 5% today rather than 1%, we'd be in a better place, not a worse place. It was yesterday the stock market went down 1%. We don't know what it will do today. Probably not so much. Because again, there are people who are saying it's not so bad, it's not so real. So when you see the demented person walking down the street slapping old ladies, somebody's got to put handcuffs on him. And the first step is, giving him a shock back. So he's stunned and dazed and stops his rampage. So uh, the there are parts of American society that are treating this as kind of a joke. I remember when Trump began talking about annexing Canada, I was invited to join a magazine symposium by an American magazine where a witty editor said, "Why don't we talk about Canada annexing the United States?" I said, "We shouldn't treat this as a joke. Obviously, Canada's not going to be annexed, but it's not funny.
Yes.
This is a declaration of malice and hostility that's going to have large reverberations."
Yes.
And as we see at the same time as these tariffs are happening, to make it less Canada specific, the Vice President of the United States gave a TV interview in which he denigrated the contributions of Britain and France to American security, in which he denied the British contribution to Afghanistan. Just said, these are joke countries that haven't fought a war in 30 or 40 years. Estonia took casualties. It's a small country, but it took heavy casualties in Afghanistan because the United States asked it to. So there's an anti-social destroy the apparatus of the alliance, and it needs an alarm. And so the retaliation, and obviously it will hurt Canada too. Canada is at a disadvantage here. This is a kind of dumping the bucket of cold water over your head contest. He dumps a bucket of cold water over his head, you dump one over yours, and he's got a thicker head with more hair. So he will win if the contest goes on long enough. But the hope is just that you can jolt people in understanding the seriousness of the situation, and it must stop because it's going to do permanent harm. Everyone is coming away from this thinking this is not just the whimsicality of Donald Trump, the madness of King George that we saw in term one, surrounded by reasonably responsible people. This is now, the Trump has surrounded himself with other people who share his hostility to the whole alliance system and want to make the United States a predatory imperial power as much like Russia and China as they can do.
Yeah, well, that's a great transition to the subject of last week's spectacle in the Oval Office, which you wrote so intelligently about in an essay for The Atlantic, where, among other things, you make the point you just made, which is part of what's happening here is that the Trump cabinet and the broader panoply of people around him are either enabling him or actually support the things that he's doing. I have to just ask directly, what's your reaction to the treatment of Zelensky in Ukraine? And as importantly, David, what explains the animus towards Zelensky himself? One gets the sense that this is, in a way, bigger and smaller than some of these broader issues. That it really is a personal disdain for Zelensky.
Well, let's start with the second part, the personal reaction to Zelensky. So I think a lot of that traces back to that moment in 2019 where Zelensky was newly elected, and Trump tried to blackmail him, extort from him the fabrication of electioneering dirt against Joe Biden.
Yes.
And Zelensky, whose courage was not yet as famous as it is now, balked. He wouldn't do it. And at first he just tried to meet Trump by delay and evasion, and you can't mean it, and we'll think about it, we'll investigate. But he didn't give Trump what he wanted. And then the horror of what Trump was doing, extorting an embattled foreign leader to say, fabricate dirt on my political opponent, or else I cut off U.S. aid to your country, which was already, the invasion of Ukraine begins in 2014. It was already fighting a war against the Russians in the Donbass.
Yes.
Lower intensity war than now, but still a war. I'll cut off aid unless you give me what I want. And this eventually did leak, and it led to the first of the Trump impeachments, rightly so. And ever since then, Trump has blamed Zelensky. And the people around him, I think, have fed on Trump's hostility and his family's hostility. But I think there's something more that is going on. MAGA is this celebration of male grievance. It's this cult of manhood. But in fact, the people around Trump are cowardly, contemptible people, um, and they're soft, and they steal, they get rich in corrupt ways, and then they're confronted with the Zelensky we saw in February of 2022, with this extraordinary act of personal courage. The Russians coming to his capital, he's offered exit
Yes.
by an evacuation and he refuses, and he says, "I'm going to basically, we will win this war, or I will die in the ruins of my capital city.
Yes.
You will see my face, not my back." And I think he just shames them. He just shames them. Every time J.D. Vance looks at Zelensky, he sees a better man. And he hates it because at some level, if you're a J.D. Vance, you have to know what you are. And you have systems of justification, but you have to know you're a troll, you're a bully, you're just a lesser person. And here is the bravest leader in the world, and he makes you feel. So you have to create these fantastic stories about he's stealing billions to buy yachts. That describes the people in the Trump circle. But so they have this animus against him because they have to, because otherwise, if he's not what they say he is, what are they?
Yeah, wow. I have to ask another question that's been on my mind for the past few days, and in which I haven't seen a lot of analysis or commentary. There's been a tendency to report and comment on this story through the lens of the personal relationship and Trump and politics and so on. But why don't you comment on the basic assumptions underlying the minerals agreement itself? What does it say about American policy that after supporting Ukraine in a conflict with Russia after Russia's unlawful invasion, America is now, after the fact, essentially saying, you need to enter into a financial agreement with us to, for all intents and purposes, pay us back. How does that compare to American policy in the past, and what do you think of it more generally?
Well, this is something of a personal bugaboo of Trump's. He signed a similar agreement with Afghanistan in 2017, which didn't stop him from negotiating with the Taliban. This is the pretext for the threats against the sovereignty of Greenland, which seem to have stopped, at least for now. He wanted some mineral agreement with Greenland. Look, we live in a world bound by trade agreements. If you want to mine in Greenland, you can mine in Greenland. I mean, you have to pay for the contracts because it's not there. This is not a fascist or a communist economy. The mines are owned by somebody.
Sure.
And of course, you have to comply with the relevant environmental legislation and the relevant labor legislation. But you want to open a mine in Greenland, it can be done, subject to the laws of economics. In Ukraine, once the war is over, Ukraine will of course be looking for sources of revenue.
Yes.
And if they have the mineral wealth, they will of course be looking to license that. But they will want to sell it to the highest bidder in a free market, not to enter into a colonial relationship, which is what Trump is actually asking for, is exactly the kind of thing that Putin asked for, which is, I want to use my military power to seize, without properly paying for it, an asset and colonially exploit it. That's his idea. This is the thing he said about Iraq, that the way American foreign policy since the war has been run by people with an understanding of free market economics, which is what you do when you have a war-ravaged country. You get it up on its feet. You provide a structure of security, and then the best thing you can do is make property rights secure and open markets.
Yes.
And whoever owns the minerals should license them to the highest bidder.
Yes.
And that's good for everybody, including the highest bidder, by the way. Because if you give it to a lower bidder, the minerals will not be put to their best and highest use. The highest bidder knows best how to use the minerals.
I'm gonna
because we're not communists, and Trump thinks like a predator, and he thinks like a colonialist.
Yes, I'm gonna say something. I'll warn you ahead. I'm gonna say something flattering, and you're just gonna have to sit through it for a minute. One thing that has struck me over the past several weeks, David, is this shift in Republican politics from a conception of American power around the world that one might describe as an understanding of American primacy, to now one of a central essentially unilateral withdrawal from being a global superpower, from being a unipolar power. That there are few people, with the exception of you, still communicating and advancing the notion that American primacy is good for America and good for the world. What do you think has happened? Where have the American primacists gone? Why has this view suddenly taken over the Republican Party and American conservatism more generally, that the era of American primacy is self-evidently over, and that it's actually in America's interests to cease being a quote-unquote exceptional country and start to act, as you said earlier, as a major power, but one that that is far more transactional and far less committed to global cooperation economically and from a security perspective.
Well, I don't think everyone has given it up, but many people have stopped saying it, partly because you have to say the same thing over and over again, and only someone as pedantic as me will say it over and over again. But I think there's something also that derives from having grown up in Canada and still spending a lot of time. There are a number of people who comment on foreign policy in the United States who were born outside the United States, but they usually have entered the United States life so entirely that they at least see or speak entirely from an American point of view. And I have, because I spend so much time in Canada, this kind of double vision. And I think also maybe it's because I'm haunted by a vision of how empires do end. This is where the story began with that silly movie from the 1980s. Yes. The story of the Euro-Atlantic world over the past 500 years has been the story of the rise of one hegemonic power after another. Habsburg Spain, Louis XIV's France, the Kaiser's Germany, Soviet Union you could think of as in this way. And what happens to all of these powers is they eventually get pulled down, because although they may be the strongest individual power, the coalition of powers the powers opposing them are greater in potential power, sure. And their obnoxious behavior forces all the other powers to combine against the biggest power and tear it down. And that's what happens to the Habsburgs. That's what happens to the Bourbons, and there are other examples. In a way, it's what happened to even the British Empire, because in 1870 it was alone, and the Germans built. First, they created the German Empire. And then they pulled together other countries and they created this kind of continental superpower that in the end destroyed the British Empire over 2 world wars. The United States has been different because first, it's been bigger and more powerful than anything that went before it, but also because it had this intuition. I don't know how articulate this ever was. The way you prevent people from combining against you is by offering them such a good deal that they would be crazy to unite against you. So when the deal was, well, what if we use our great power to provide not only our security, but your security too? What if we build trading arrangements in which we don't just take everything for ourselves, but offer a fair field to all commerce, where you can get much richer than you could if your own ships were patrolling the world seaways? Your commerce is just as safe if we patrol the world seaways, and you get richer. Isn't this and the other countries of the world have said, you know what, they're flashpoints, and I don't want to gild the history too much. But basically, from 1945 until recently, most countries in the world, including some that were not democratic, said the Americans are offering a pretty attractive and fair deal. They get a lot from it, but we all get a lot. What Trump is doing is, by reconceiving the United States as a predatory power like China, like Russia, like in its way India, he's saying there's unless the person on the other side of the table also gets a transactional advantage. Our power can be dangerous to you. That's the thing that is different about this conflict over Ukraine with Europe and all previous U.S.-Europe conflicts, of which there have been many. The chicken wars of the 1960s, the dispute over Iraq in 2003, those are disagreements. But there was never a sense that the Americans were dangerous to Europe in a way that Europeans now think they're aligned with the Russians against Europe. They see Europe as an enemy, the way many Canadians see. And Canadians are talking about things. I've said on the show before that people are talking about things that no one should speak aloud in public. But I've begun to hear those things spoken louder and louder. If the Americans say no more Five Eyes, Canada says no more NORAD. And the whole structure of North American continental air and space defense could come under dissolution, because people see the Americans not just as asking things they don't want, but as actively dangerous. And this is how this great source of peace and prosperity for the world comes unstuck. And because I'm so very attached to it, it's like the central intellectual issue of my writing life.
Yes.
I see the danger to it so clearly and worry about this danger so very, very much.
Let me put a final question to you. What you just set out here with me and in your fine essay in The Atlantic reminded me of something that Charles Krauthammer, who also spent time in Canada, used to say, which is decline is a choice. And one sentence in your essay really struck me. You write, quote, Trump and Vance don't want the United States to be that kind of country anymore.
Yeah.
And I guess my question for you, David, is are there enough Americans who want to continue to be that country to think that that the path that the administration is taking the United States on can be halted or reversed, or is there insufficient collective commitment on the parts of the United States to be the country that you've just discussed? That decline is somewhat inevitable.
Well, we'll find out. As so often during the Trump years, I have this. There are always these questions about prediction.
Yes.
And I always beg off because predictions they sort of move the onus from the person who's being asked to some impersonal spectrum of events.
Yes.
That the question that we need to ponder is not are there enough people, but where are you? You in the third row there, senator, member of the House, member of the press, academic, member of the military. Are you what are you going to do as Trump breaks apart the structure of security and prosperity that's done so much good for the United States and the world since 1945? Because it's not something it's not something that you just watch happen. It's something you participate in one way or another. So if they can, so Senator Ernst, who right now is having a very bad day because of this Oppo dump on her by her own party, what will she do? She may not have very much time left in the U.S. Senate. How will she use that time? And so many others. How will they use their time? Of course, the outcomes depend on the choices people make, and people are free to make those choices. I don't know that decline is a choice. I don't know that the Romans thought it over and said, we just barbarians, you take it. I think there's some objective preconditions for the rise and fall of power. But in this case, right now, what Trump is doing, there is no objective reason to do any of this. It's all Dummerstrasse. It's all just foolishness. It's done by spite and ignorance and just malignity. These choices don't have to be made, and Congress could stop many of them. And the Republicans theoretically have a majority in Congress. They certainly have a majority in the Senate. It's up to them. And if they don't, then the shame is shared not just by Trump and Vance, with all of their murky connections to Russia, but by everyone who didn't act to stop them, who had the power to stop them.
Brilliant way to wrap up. David, let me just say how great it is to be back in conversation with you. We had a lot of audience members asking for your thoughts and your voice, given what's playing out. I'm grateful to have connected and look forward to catching up in a couple of weeks.
Bye-bye.